What I'm going to be talking about this evening is, we're carrying on our series, which is based on this book by Sangharakshita called Creative Symbols of Tantric Buddhism, where we talk about symbolism of Tantric Buddhism, or what we call Vajrayana Buddhism, various names that path has: the Diamond Vehicle, the Diamond Way. It's also called the Mantrayana, or the Way of Mantra. And that tradition of Buddhism, or that sort of phase of Buddhism, you could say, is steeped in myth and symbolism. And what we're doing in this series is we're unpacking some of those symbols. And what I'm going to be talking about this evening is the stupa, or the burial mound. Now, everything on this shrine means something, basically. Every single thing. And the longer you are here, and the more you study, and the more you meditate, the more you might come to see the depth and the richness of everything that's on the shrine. So we have these lotuses behind us that mean something. We have the Buddha there. He's holding his hands in a particular way. So that's called a mudra, the hand position. And every hand position of the Buddha means something. I'm not going to go into what this one means. The fact that the Buddha is golden actually means something. Obviously, the Buddha wouldn't really have looked like that. He sat on a lotus flower. That has meaning. That is a symbol. He's not just sat on a lotus flower for the sake of it. And depending on how long you've been coming along, you may or may not have noticed these things on the shrine before. So these little wooden constructions are called stupas. And usually they sit at the back of the shrine here. So just out of interest, who remembers these, or who's noticed these before? Okay, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, yeah, a handful of you, yeah. They're always here, but we don't always draw attention to them. But what I'm going to do this evening is I've moved them right to the front of the shrine, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what these mean. And hopefully by the end of this evening, you'll have a sort of a deeper sense of that. I'm going to start off by telling you a story from the Buddha's life, or I'm actually going to talk about a particular phase of the Buddha's life, and that is the period towards the end of his life, and particularly the Buddha's death. It's actually not true to talk about the Buddha dying in the usual sense of the word. So the Buddha didn't have an ordinary human consciousness, so in that sense, death would not have meant the same. When a Buddha dies, it's not the same as an ordinary human being dying. But the Buddha knew that he was basically coming to the end of his life in terms of the fact that he had a body which was subject to certain causes and conditions, and because of that, he knew that his body would pass away at a certain point. So even a Buddha doesn't escape the death of the body, but because he has this refined, enlightened consciousness, his death means something different. But towards the end of his life, he had a sense that he would no longer inhabit his body soon, and that he would die, in inverted commas. And this is what we call the parinirvana of the Buddha. So that in itself is interesting. Para means something like supreme or ultimate. And you have these two phrases, samsara and nirvana. So samsara meaning conditioned existence, earthly existence, the usual way that we are in the world with all of our sort of ignorance and suffering. Nirvana meaning, to put it clumsily, the everything that is not that, the opposite of that, so liberation from that. And parinirvana means something like ultimate liberation from that. So the Buddha was coming close to his parinirvana, and one of the things that happened during this period of time, I'm going to highlight a few episodes from that period. One of the things that happened was that one of the Buddha's followings came and made an offering to him and some of his monks of these new robes, basically. So the Buddha wore robes, and traditionally at certain times the Buddha's followers would be offered new robes, basically. That still goes on to this day in monastic communities in Asia. And these robes were woven with golden thread. So they were beautiful, like golden robes, basically, like shining, beautiful, radiant. And Ananda noticed one day that when the Buddha was presented with these robes, that the Buddha was so radiant and so beautiful and so sort of shining and luminous that he actually made the robes look dull. And he commented on this to the Buddha, and the Buddha said to him, well, Ananda, it's like that on 2 occasions. I'm basically glowing with the significance of what's happening, and this happens at a Buddha's enlightenment, and it happens at his parinirvana. So the implication of that is that the Buddha's enlightenment and his parinirvana are sort of equal in their significance, basically. That when a Buddha dies, it's as significant as the Buddha gaining enlightenment. So we might think of, well, hopefully we think of the Buddha's enlightenment as this supremely significant event. You know, there would be no Buddhism, there'd be no Dharma, there'd be no tradition. None of us would be here if it wasn't for the Buddha gaining enlightenment. But what the Buddha was saying is that his parinirvana was just as significant. So I'm going to try and unpack a little bit about why that might be. So I think it's interesting that the Buddha knew that he was going to die, and he very, very clearly chose to do certain things towards the end of his life. So one of the things that the Buddha chose to do was to go on retreat. So that's interesting, isn't it? Like, we stand up at the tea break every week and we say, look, the best thing you can do is go on retreat. The best thing you can do with your time is spend time on retreat. And that's not just us making that up. So the Buddha actually did this himself just before the end of his life. He decided that he would go on a retreat for a period of time. So he did what's called the traditional rains retreat with his friend and attendant Ananda. And also, he sort of composed any difficulty or any disharmony that was there in the Sangha. So one of the things that happened was there was a follower of the Buddha called Kunda who offered the Buddha his last meal. And this is what basically made the Buddha ill and ultimately led to his death. So Kunda invited the Buddha to his house and he gave him some food. We don't know exactly what it was, but the Buddha got food poisoning and started to become quite ill. And the Buddha was very, very concerned that Kunda would be blamed for his death. So he communicated this to his followers, that actually it was very, very auspicious that Kunda did this, and that actually to give a Buddha his last meal was very, very meritorious. And I think there's something quite wonderful about that. There's something quite beautiful about that. That the Buddha, even though you could say he had actually been made ill by this meal, he was very, very keen that Kunda wouldn't be, sort of blamed in any way, or that this would cause any difficulty for him. Actually, what he wanted was for Kunda to be, relaxed and free from blame and just able to carry on following his teachings. So eventually the Buddha arrived at this place called Kushinagar, and that was where the Buddha died. And he lay down on a makeshift stone couch between 2 trees, and it's said that the trees went into blossom, unseasonably went into blossom. So it wasn't the time for those trees to blossom, but they started blossoming and they started raining down petals and flowers on the Buddha. And apparently there was this beautiful smell of frankincense and there was this celestial music playing. So that's a very, very beautiful image, isn't it? That gives us something of the idea of how significant this event was. It's almost like nature was sort of recognizing what a wonderful and significant event this was for the Buddha passing away, basically, the Buddha's parinirvana. And right at the end of his life, Ananda, who'd been the Buddha's attendant and friend throughout his life, he knew that the Buddha was going to die soon, and he gets very upset, basically. So he's very, very distressed about the fact that the Buddha's going to die. So he takes himself off and he starts crying. And at a certain point, the Buddha wants to talk to him and he can't find him. So he says, what's happened to Ananda? And one of the Buddha's followers says, actually, he's gone off somewhere because he's really, really upset. So the Buddha invites him back, and and he talks to Ananda, and he says a few things of quite key importance. So the first thing he says to Ananda is to remind him that all conditioned things are impermanent. That the Buddha has a body, so therefore that body has to die. And he also says to Ananda, he rejoices in Ananda basically. So he says, look, haven't I told you that everything is impermanent? And then he has a sense that he's going to die soon, and he rejoices in Ananda. So in front of all of his followers, he basically rejoices in Ananda's positive qualities, and particularly how he is with other people. He says, Ananda's always such a faithful friend. He's there. He's served me for most of his life. He's very, very kind. He's very, very generous. Whenever Ananda is around, people are happy, and whenever he stops talking, people are sad, which is such a beautiful thing to say. And he also assures Ananda that he will soon be enlightened, because Ananda knows that he's not enlightened. And he says this to the Buddha. He's sad basically that his teacher is leaving before he's gained enlightenment himself. So both of these episodes, I think, from the episode with Kunda, where he's very, very keen to make sure that Kunda is not blamed, and the rejoicing in Ananda, I think they point to something. And all throughout the Buddha's life, we have things like this. We have the Buddha's teaching, but the way the Buddha lived his life is a teaching in itself. The things that he did, the things that he said, the way he was with people, the way he acted, often they're as much of a teaching as his actual formal teaching and his words himself. And what these actions put me in mind of is there's a verse in the Dhammapada, which is very, very early sayings of the Buddha. And we think this is about as close to the words of the Buddha as we could actually get. And what this verse describes is how we would live if we actually knew the truth of impermanence, if we knew the truth of, that we were all going to die, that everyone that we know is going to die, that everything conditioned is impermanent. If we knew that, how would we actually live? And this verse says, others do not realize that we are all heading for death. Those who do realize it will compose their quarrels. Others do not realize that we are all heading for death. Those who do realize it will compose their quarrels. So what that's pointing to is a teaching for us. If we were really able to take on board this teaching of impermanence, the core teaching of the Buddha that he comes back to again and again and again is that all conditioned things are impermanent. But we can't see that. We don't live our lives in that way, basically. We sort of swan around, not really wanting to face up to that truth, not really wanting to face up to that fact, distracting ourselves endlessly with things that are often just pretty pointless. That might just be me, I don't know. If that rings any bells with you, I don't know. Like last night, I was here actually to meet a friend of mine, and then I went home and I had like a spare hour. And I thought, what shall I do with that hour? I thought, and I could meditate, I could study the Dharma, I could do all sorts of things. So I watched like an hours long documentary on Netflix. And it was nothing like really horrendous. But at the end of it, I just thought, God, that was so pointless. Like, there's an hour of my life that I'm just not going to get back, basically. And I don't know how much of my life is left, actually. So we all do this sort of thing, don't we? I think over the years, as I've been practicing and as I've been meditating, actually I do that a lot less, and there are certain things, other things that I don't do anymore, which mean I'm wasting my time less and less. But even then, I still do it. It's like I haven't fully taken that on board. If we were to take that on board, we would live our lives differently. And I think what I've been talking about with Kunda and Ananda, the Buddha doesn't actually have quarrels to compose, but he is just naturally living his life in such a way that he's creating harmony around him, he's creating beauty around him. And I think the more we live in the light of taking that truth on board, the more we just naturally do that, actually. It's how we want to be, it's how we want to behave in the world. That's essentially what he's talking about. So right at the end of his life, the Buddha gave two final teachings. So he said two things, and these are the Buddha's final words, basically. And there are various translations of this, but one of the translations is, all component things in the world are changeable. They're not lasting. With mindfulness, strive on. So in other words, it's translated as, all conditioned things are impermanent. And so he's basically saying, look, everything that you think you can rely on, everything that you think has a sense of permanence, is actually going to come to an end. All of this is coming to an end all the time. Your life is coming to an end. Other people's lives are coming to an end. In the light of that, practice. There's a sense of urgency about that. Develop your mind, develop your consciousness, because there's this potential for you to actually see through that and to see things as they really, really are. While I was reading around this a little bit, I came across this lovely quote from a Chinese philosopher and apparently military strategist, which is a strange combination, but there we are, a guy called Sun Tzu. And he was a contemporary of the Buddha, and he said, even the finest sword plunged into salt water will eventually rust. Even the finest sword plunged into salt water will eventually rust. So everything that we think of as permanent actually is dissolving, is fading away. And you can reflect on that and think of that in terms of death or our life coming to an end. But it's not just that, actually. It's like the things that we take for granted. So like in my mind, it's even things like a mind where I can meditate, or I can learn, or I can reflect. So in the back of my mind, I assume that I've got, lots and lots of time to practice, and I've got time to go on retreat, and I've got time to meditate. Not only do you not know how long you're actually going to be alive, but you don't know how long you're going to have the capacity to do that. I was very, very moved this week. I was reading a letter by a member of our order who's talking about the fact that she has dementia. So she's aware of the fact that she has dementia. She is trying to practice the Dharma. She's trying to practice the Buddha's teachings. And she was happy about the fact that she'd been on retreat lately, and she had this very, very strong insight into the nature of things, which felt very liberating for her. And she then had a sense that it was still possible at this stage of her having dementia for that to happen. And I thought, that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not just our life that we can take for granted. It's actually even the capacity to practice, or having a mind that is actually capable of practicing. We don't know how long we'll have that. We don't know how long we'll be here, and we don't know how long we'll have a mind that is fit for practice, or is suitable for practice. So I think it's really important when we're talking about all of this to have a sense of the fact that why I'm talking about this is to point to the fact that we have this incredible potential. This is what the Buddha represents on the shrine. He's not just saying everything's going to come to an end. He's not all just saying you're all going to die and everyone you love is going to die. What he's saying is what his enlightenment experience was, in a sense, is him breaking through that. It's actually him transcending the question of life and death. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what that means. I can actually signpost you to another talk, so I'm sort of pointing off in that direction. Subhuti gave a talk on this at the London Buddhist Centre a couple of weeks ago, where he talked about what does it actually mean for a Buddha to have conquered death. You know, the Buddha said that he had found the deathless, basically. What does that actually mean? I'll just leave the mystery of that for the moment. But what he's saying is, we're in this predicament where we don't see things as they are, and we suffer because of that, and it's possible for us to go beyond that. But we need to have a sense of urgency about that. Your life is not going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever. You need to start practicing, basically. And what the Tantra is pointing to is that sense of urgency. That phase of Buddhism held that enlightenment is possible in one lifetime. But basically, you need to get cracking and you need to get on with the job. And what the stupa points to is the urgency of that. So I'm going to say a little bit how in a moment, but I thought before I do that, I'll just pause and see if there are any questions or if anybody wants to say anything or any clarifications or... Yes?
About actually like knowing the word of like every hour, you mentioned like you watch Netflix documentary and that. For me, when I try to do that, I think it can be sometimes stressing.
Yeah.
You know, like every minute should be like work and I should be doing something.
Okay,
like
okay. Yeah.
And everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, what do you think about
Yeah, well, that's an important point, isn't it? Yeah, I would like to say something about that. Because I'm talking in such a way that you might get a sense of, like, when I say, for example, urgency, have a sense of urgency about this, you might think, oh my God, what am I going to do? Oh, da, da, da. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about can actually, there is a sense of urgency in the sense that you need to wake up to the fact that time is finite. And if you know that, do you really want to spend your time watching clips on YouTube, or do you want to do something more constructive, or do you want to do something that is actually leading you somewhere, towards enlightenment, towards transcending, towards something more beautiful, more fulfilling? But that's one way of talking about it. But actually, the change in perspective that requires can actually be quite gentle. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to feel urgent. Actually, what it is just gently bringing a different perspective all of the time. So, the more, what I've found over the years anyway, is the more I meditate, the more I'm just living more consciously. So I have that choice available to me. I have the choice about, before I open my mouth, of being aware of what it is that I'm going to say. I have the choice in the moment often of just thinking, actually, am I happy with what I'm doing here? And perhaps even more slightly removed from that, just stepping back from time to time and thinking about how one is living one's life and thinking, do I want to be doing these things? What are the things that I want to be doing, And I think the perspective that's involved in that can be a subtle shift, but it's powerful and it's profound. But it doesn't need to feel urgent in the sense of it doesn't mean just like creating a massive long to-do list, for example, of like, okay, well, I've only got so much time, therefore I want to do these 50 things. It can be a gentle shift in perspective, but one which is quite powerful. Okay. So I'm going to start getting on to actually talking about the stupa a little bit. So when the Buddha died, he left instructions about what he wanted done with his remains. And apparently the stupa predates Buddhism. And actually not only that, but existed in other parts of the world before or sort of coterminously with when it existed in Asia. And when the Buddha died, he said that he wanted his robes, he wanted his robes folded and his begging bowl put on top. So it was like, I'll draw this up here. Basically it formed a structure that was a little bit like this. So he had his robes, because he wore robes. I'm just doing a little one here because I'm going to do a bigger diagram here in a minute. and his begging bowl on top. So we know that the Buddha, the Buddha and his followers basically begged for their food. And there was this very, very simple thing where the Buddha wanted his robes folded into four and he wanted his bowl put on top. And that basically symbolized, it was a reminder of who the Buddha was and how he lived his life. And then what happened was, after the Buddha died, they had his remains basically. So they had his ashes, and they had some of his teeth and so on, and some of his bones apparently. And there was a quarrel that broke out. So there was a group of people that had the Buddha's remains because he died in their sort of kingdom, so to speak. So at the time, India was made up of these sort of ancient fiefdoms. Excuse me. And a quarrel broke out about what to do with the Buddha's remains. And some of the Buddha's followers said, look, this is crazy. This is absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about this man who espoused peace and harmony and wanted to promote compassion between us all. Why are we fighting over this? So they divided the Buddha's relics up between them, and there were these 8 groups of people, and each of them went off to different places, and they constructed these structures that looked like this, basically. So they had like a base and then a sort of a bowl on top. And you can still see structures like this to this day in India. So there's a place in India that I used to go to called Baja Retreat Centre, which is not far from Mumbai. And there are stupas that look like this in some caves nearby, and you can see them all over Asia. And that's what this is basically, is like a reminder of who the Buddha was, with this very, very simple structure here with the Buddha's bowl on top. So it's interesting thinking about why the Buddha wanted to be remembered like this, isn't it? So he left instructions about what he wanted doing with his remains, but it's not because he wanted to be remembered in that usual sense. Not like a famous person who dies and says, oh, I'd like to be remembered by my body of work or my songs or whatever it is. It's not like that at all. So the Buddha wouldn't have felt that way, basically. What he did want was for people to remember to practice his teaching, basically. And he wanted them to be cognizant of the fact that even a Buddha dies, but that he was pointing to something beyond that. He was pointing a way beyond that. So people wanted to remember the Buddha, and this is how he said to do it, basically. So they created these structures. So the Buddha was concerned with waking us up, primarily. He spent his life teaching. So he said that he was enlightened at the age of 35. He taught and taught and taught to whoever would come along to see him. Anyone from any walk of life could come and speak to him, and he taught them, and he was concerned with waking us up from this sort of this delusion or this sense of this state of suffering that we're in. To do that, we need to remember that all things are impermanent. And, not only that, but there is more to life than that. There is this sense of possibility that we have. So it's interesting then to go back a little bit, isn't it, to the Buddha's going forth. So do most of you know the story about how the Buddha became the Buddha and his going forth, his leaving the palace that he lived in? Put your hands up if you know that story. Yeah, most of you do. Okay. Yeah, so we know that the Buddha left his palace, he went forth, and he set out on this quest for enlightenment. And he did that on the basis of what we call the 4 sights, didn't he? So old age, sickness, and death. So he left the palace and he'd seen an old person, a sick person, and a dead person. And this shook him to his core. And he knew that he couldn't go back to his previous life. He knew that he had to live completely differently. And that he needed to try and find an answer to the problem of old age, sickness and death, basically. So, this was the basis for the entire Buddhist path. And it's like then he's reminding us of that. So the problem of old age, sickness and death, but also that it's possible to go beyond that as well, which was represented when he went forth by the fourth sight. So he saw this holy man who pointed to the way that there was something beyond old age, sickness and death. So I've been thinking a bit about this recently, and just sort of taking this perspective on board, really. How would it be to live in the light of this? So to live in the light of impermanence, to live in the light of the fact that we can't take our lives for granted. We do take our lives for granted, but doing that actually causes us suffering. And if we were able to live more consciously and more fully in the light of this truth, how would that be? So I was very, very affected by this when I was 24 and my father died. So my dad died when I was quite young. And that had a very, very powerful effect on me at the time, and one which was quite liberating as well. So I didn't expect my father to die. He died quite unexpectedly. And I was quite young at the time. And what that did was it sort of freed me up in a way. As far as I was concerned, at that time in my life, that was probably the worst thing that could have happened to me. For various reasons, which I won't go into now. I couldn't imagine that happening, and I didn't want it to happen, and it happened. And the effect of that was quite interesting. It was interesting for a few reasons, but one of them was just sort of thinking, okay, this thing that I really didn't want to happen has happened, and I felt some grief around it, and I also felt a tremendous sense of liberation. It was almost like possibilities opened up. It was like the truth of death and impermanence had come to me in a very, very tangible sense. And I don't know, it just had an effect on me in that I knew that I didn't want to carry on living my life in the way that I had been. And one of the things that I did as a result of that was I was working for a charity at the time, and because of the nature of the charity, it was relatively easy for me to just go and work somewhere else in the world. So I went to Calcutta for a year and worked in Calcutta. And partly I did that because I just thought, God, life is short. And I was living this life where I was doing lots of things that weren't really going anywhere. And I just felt like I really needed to change things and shake things up. And that sort of perspective came out of feeling quite liberated and feeling quite free. And recently what's happened is I've been reflecting on this a little bit because with the nature of my work now, I still work in India. I go and work in India for 2 or 3 months of the year. And last time I was in India, I passed the age that my father was when he died. So my father was 49 years and 80 days old when he died. And I'm now 49 years and 180 days old. So that was quite a strange experience for me, thinking I'm the same age. I remember on that very, very day thinking I'm the same age as he was when he died, and every day subsequently feeling like I've now outlived my parent, and okay, I'm not young, but I'm not yet 50, But actually, what that's enabled me to feel is a sense of kind of, the way I've been thinking about it is almost like having a kind of a bonus life. It's like if I died at the same age as him, I'd already be dead. Now, everything is like this wonderful kind of open space where it's like if I can wake up and every so often just think like, I might not be here actually. It's like a gift, and it's almost like, with that gift there's a sense of space, there's a sense of openness, there's a sense of possibility, and in that I'm sort of asking myself the question, well, how do I want to live actually? What do I want to do? I'm quite happy to say that mostly I just want to keep doing the things that I'm doing. There's nothing particularly radically different that I want to do. But still, that reminder, I think, is very, very helpful. It's not necessarily even what do I want to do, it's how do I want to be. Do I want to hold on to petty resentments? Do I want to fritter my time away? Do I want to engage in stuff that doesn't go anywhere or is largely meaningless? Just asking oneself that question. And particularly the effect that I notice with that is in my communication with some people, just being much more direct with people, particularly people that I love and appreciate, is just really letting them know that I love and appreciate them. What I'm going to suggest we do, actually, for a few minutes, is I'm going to ask you to get into pairs and introduce yourselves to each other. And I'm not going to get you to sign anything, don't worry. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, if you really took this teaching to heart, what might you do differently? As I said, it's not set in stone. You're going to go away at the end of this evening, and no one's ever going to know whether you follow through on this or not. But just ask yourself the question. Ask each other that question. If I really took this teaching to heart, what would it actually mean for me? What might I do, or what might I do differently, or what might I not do? Is that clear? Yeah, so get into pairs, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to discuss that. Okay, so if you haven't swapped over, then swap over. So I just wonder, would anyone want to share what you talked about, or how was it to think about that?
Pretty powerful.
Say again?
It's pretty powerful.
Pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Who said that? I can't see. Yeah. Could you say why?
Well, it made me think about really large things in my life, but also about small daily things like, I think I related to the thing about Netflix and about how I must always be doing something rather than just enjoying having food.
Right.
Or also how much I ignore people around me that live on my street.
Yeah.
And how that makes you feel.
Yeah.
You know, like alienated.
Yeah.
And how useless that is.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting, isn't it? There's a real sort of paradox there that, like you say, actually sometimes thinking about something like that paradoxically makes us think we might want to do a little bit less sometimes. And then it sounds like also you're talking about connecting with other people that you haven't connected with as well. That's lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah. Anyone else?
I was saying I'd like to spend more time in nature and with like animals, like really like cats, and I don't have a cat at the moment, so something I would like, if I knew I was going to die soon, I'd like try and hang out with cats.
I don't know why, but it's just perfect coming from you, Pete. Yeah. Okay, lovely. Anyone else want to say anything? Go on, Nadia. Yeah.
I was just saying to Alex, I feel like you, I'm the other way around. I'm so preoccupied about death and time running out.
Oh,
so
okay, that's
in a
interesting.
way, it means that I waste more time and energy.
Right, okay.
Just fretting and being preoccupied.
Right, okay, yeah.
Because both my parents died when I was a child.
Yeah.
Like from the age of 11, I was just growing up as an orphan. So
yeah.
knowing like very deeply about mortality and impermanence is like something that's feels very deeply imprinted. But I was saying that if I sort of was a bit more chilled about it, right.
Or
sort of felt it with a more keenness and a bit more balance, I think I would just do the things that I need to do despite being tired, because I think a lot of the tiredness comes from the preoccupation with time running out. But I would just do those things anyway, even though I feel tired, because without that way, it wouldn't all jump like snowball. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So what you're saying is actually, it sounds like you need to have that reflection, but in a slightly different way, like in a bit more of a relaxed way, so you don't actually feel a bit sort of. It doesn't hold you back then, in a sense, that you can actually relax into that a little bit more. It sounds like, Great, thank you, Nadia. Yeah, and Kuslasara, you were going to say something.
Oh, it's just interesting. Nick and I both, our responses were relational about who we want to speak well, spend more time with, or be more affectionate towards. Sort of getting a bit of clarity about that.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So relational, to do with people. I've mentioned this before, so some of you that know me have kind of heard this before, but I stopped doing this about 10 years ago, but I used to do this job where I used to run workshops and discussion groups with older people. It was wonderful. I did it for about 10 years. And I used to run these groups basically where I'd get people to talk about their lives and to do sort of like reminiscence and talking about values and this sort of thing. And like pretty much every time I used to ask this question at the start of a group, which was like, when you look back on your life, what are you most proud of? And like 99% of the time, it would always be relational. It would always be to do with people. It would be to do, well, it was either people or values. So it would be people living according to certain values. So people had helped their community, or which again is relational, isn't it? Or it would be to do with that they'd been a good father, or they'd been a good mother, or something like that. It was always to do with people. It was never to do with things. It was never like, I'm proud of the fact that I own this massive villa in Spain, or I accumulated so much money, or I've got a fleet of expensive cars, or whatever it is. Like, you would imagine that that's the case, but it's worth saying, like, it's never about things. It's never about, the paradox is, it's never about the things that we spend most of our time on, or a lot of people spend most of their time on, actually are the things that are going to be least important when you get to the end of your life. That's the paradox, isn't it? We spend a lot of our life trying to go, or some people spend a lot of their time trying to go for status and money and property and possessions and things like that. And those things will not be of any value to you at all when you get to the end of your life. And I have that on good authority from many, many 80 and 90-year-olds who told me. Anyway. So one of the reflections I think that comes out of that from hearing you speak is like, it's just about living consciously. So for me, when I reflect on these things, it just makes me want to practice the Buddha's teaching more deeply. It makes me want to meditate more, makes me want to try and become wiser, more compassionate, and so on. But I remember a few years ago being at one of the retreat centres that I go to in Norwich, and there's a teacher there who I really look up to, and he said this thing which I found very moving. He said when people come on retreat there, he wants them to go away with a sense of purpose about their life. It's like, just live consciously. In a way, it doesn't even really matter. It does matter what you do, but just live consciously, live deliberately. Like, the real tragedy is if you're just going through life and you're doing a load of stuff and you don't even really think you should be doing it, or you don't know quite why you're doing it. It's just living in such a way that you've made a decision about what it is that you actually want to do. You've really reflected on that decision, and then you're putting it into practice, and you're actually living in such a way that is conscious and deliberate. Okay, so while you were all chatting, I've put this kind of diagram on the flip chart here. So you'll see the central stupa that we've got here is... one thing I didn't say, which is really important, is that I did say this with the Buddha, that I think I did anyway, that the stupas contain people's ashes. So they contain people's remains. So if that's not clear, I'm glad I did remember to tell you that, because that's really important. That's partly why they're a reminder of death and impermanence. So in the middle of the shrine here, we have so all of these little stupas are stupas for order members. So people who are part of our Buddhist order. So all of us that wear these white cases are ordained members of the Triratna Buddhist order, which means that we're part of this community and we've made a commitment to practice Buddhism for the rest of our lives. And all of these stupas on the shrine but they are stupas for order members who've died. So all of these stupas have the remains, some of the ashes of order members in them. And this one in the middle is a dear friend of mine, so a woman called Vidya Jyoti, those of you that know me will have heard me speak about her before. She died when she was in her early 70s, and I was friends with her when I was in my early 30s. Very, very unlikely friendship, and a very, very close friendship. She was a very, very dear friend of mine. I really loved her. And she died after we'd been friends for a few years. And this stupa, pretty appropriate for her. She was pretty way out there, pretty wacky, and was also an artist. And so that's not a traditional stupa, those in those colours, but it's very beautiful. And this is her stupa there, and this follows the kind of the tantric symbolism here. So each of those shapes it's a symbol for something, basically. So it actually represents the elements. So you have the cube, which represents earth. You have the sphere, which represents water. The pyramid, which represents fire. The sort of demisphere, which represents air. And then at the top, you have this kind of flame triangle type symbol, which represents space or akasha. So what that's pointing to is a kind of paradox, which is that we are made up of the elements, aren't we? Even the Buddha was made up of the elements. So in our body, it doesn't literally mean earth. What it means is it describes the way the elements behave. So earth means like sort of solid and semi-solid matter. So that would be things like, bone and teeth and nails and things like that. But it also means things like, wood. And so it's the elements in our body and outside of our body as well. And water is the kind of liquid element. Fire is the heat in our body and so on. So it represents this paradox that is like the earth is made up of these elements and our bodies are made up of these elements because our body are not they're not separate from the earth. But when we die, they'll just return to the elements, basically. So that what that points to is that there is something more. And it's mysterious, isn't it? It's like we're made up of the physical in a sense, but of course we're not only the physical. And if you look at it, each of these elements is becoming more and more refined. So it's like it becomes more refined, it becomes more... I don't know, it's almost like it's pointing upwards basically towards something which is not of the elements. So you have space, which is just what the elements exist in basically. But the word, it's not actually space, it's akasha, which is the first part of my name. And what that means is it's a space, but it's a kind of a pregnant space in which everything is arising and wisdom is arising. So the elements exist in this space, but they also point towards something beyond themselves as well. And this is what the Buddha represented, is in some senses he's an ordinary human being, he has an ordinary human body, but he is much, much more than that. He has this enlightened consciousness. And in the symbolism of the stupa, you have these elements, but they're pointing upwards towards something that is beyond themselves. Through these more and more rarefied stages, basically. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of that symbolism. So I was thinking a bit about this as well, and I was thinking about who's been to our retreat centre, Vajrasana? Quite a few of you have, yeah. So if you go to Vajrasana, there's a huge stupa in the courtyard outside the shrine room there, basically. There's an area there which is like a sort of temple complex, and there's this huge stupa there. And apparently the architects wanted it to be smaller. I have it on good authority. They wanted the stupa to be smaller. And we insisted, no, it's got to be huge, and it's got to dominate the space. Because what we do is we walk into the sort of temple precinct area and circumambulate the stupa and then go into the shrine room. Or sometimes we're in the shrine room, we're meditating, we come out and we walk around the stupa, we circumambulate the stupa. And what you're doing there is you're putting your practice in context. So you're on retreat, you're practicing, you're meditating, you're trying to be kind to each other, you're trying to communicate in a way that is real with each other, whether that's in silence or whether not, whatever it is that you're doing. And you're doing that in the light of this fact of impermanence. That's what the stupa represents, is its impermanence and death. And that stupa has the remains, ashes of order members in it as well. I was thinking about this, and one of the order members whose ashes is in that in that stupa is an order member called Mahananda, and he actually his mum was an Auschwitz survivor. She came over to the UK on kinder transport when she was a young woman, and she came to London. So came from absolute horror, came from horrendous circumstances, made a life for herself in London, ended up buying a house, which Mahanandi then left to the London Buddhist Centre, which enabled us to buy Vajrasana. And just thinking about the effect that had. So the stupa reminds us of our own mortality and our own impermanence, but is also asking you the question, well, how do you want to live? What do you want to do? Because when you're gone, all that you'll be remembered for is the effect that you had on people. And Mahananda had a huge effect on so many people here. He was a very, very loving, very affectionate, just wonderful human being, but then also had this effect of, enabling us to buy this retreat centre, basically. I was also thinking a little bit about Vidya Jyoti as well. So, I was saying she was a friend of mine. There's actually a really nice little coincidence or synchronicity, is that this series is based on this book. And Vidya Jyoti gave me a copy of this book. So there's a little inscription on it which says, Dearest James, which is what I was called before I was ordained, it says, here's more Dharma for your collection from your loving guruette, Vidya Jyoti, which I thought was very sweet. Anyway, so that was from her. She had a huge effect on my life. I moved into a flat in Bethnal Green just around the corner, and she lived in the flat underneath me, and we used to come to the Buddhist centre together. She used to come on Monday evenings, so that's why I started coming on Monday evenings, and I've just been coming on Monday evenings ever since. This was nearly 20 years ago. And just spending time with her, her friendship had a massive, massive effect on my life. And here she is in this little stupa, like continuing to just remind me of, okay, remember me that I'm not here now. How do you want to live your life? So what the Tantra is concerned with is waking us up. It's concerned with this perspective that we can have. It's like we lose perspective a lot of the time, don't we? We get caught up in the minutiae of life, faffing around, wasting our time. But actually, if we were to live in the light of this teaching and really remember that things are impermanent and that our life is impermanent, and that there is more potential, basically, that our lives can be about more than just the day-to-day and the faffing around and the wasting time, then we would live differently, basically. We would live consciously, and we would live in awareness. And that's what this the stupa is trying to teach us. That's what this symbol actually is it's like that reminder. It's saying, like, wake up, stop messing around, live consciously, live deliberately, and what does that mean for you? What are you actually going to do? Because the real tragedy, I'm just repeating myself, but the real tragedy is when you just slide through life basically not doing that, and then you don't know how long you're going to be here, and when you get to the end, how do you want to look back on your life? What do you actually want to have done? What do you want it to have meant? What effect do you want to have had on people? So I could leave it there, but we've got a couple of minutes. Maybe I'll just see if there's any questions first. Yes?
What method can you recommend to remind yourself about this?
Well, you can just recollect that fact, basically. I mean, I think it's probably worth saying that reflection on death is probably not to be taken lightly. So you need to be in quite good states to do that. In the first half of the class we were doing the Metta Bhavana, and that's a very, very good practice to be doing if you are going to do these kind of reflections. And if you find yourself reflecting on impermanence or death even, and that having a sort of, an effect on you where you actually, it doesn't have a positive effect and makes you feel down, then don't do it. Make sure you have lots of metta and approach it with caution. But I think you can just bring that to mind. One of the things that I do is I bring to mind people that I care about who've died, and I think about the effect that they've had on me, and then I try and think, okay, well, how would I then take that on for myself? What do I want to do? I think just reflect on those facts and meditate and go on retreat. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
I read in a book that actually, like we live our daily life 5% maybe consciously, but 95% is more like unconsciously, just automatic responses.
Yeah.
But like, if you try to live it more consciously, do you think would it have effect on that unconscious automatic part? How is it for you, maybe?
Well, maybe. I mean, I think probably that what that's referring to is just the things like, we don't walk down the street thinking, I'm going to put one foot in front of the other now, or, it's like, you go to work, you catch the tube, whatever. You do most of that unconsciously, don't you? You're not actually aware most of the time of all the sense data that's coming in, because you wouldn't be able to. You brush your teeth sort of slightly on autopilot, and you maybe go to work. I remember a couple of times getting on the wrong tube for that reason. I was going somewhere else, and actually I just go the route that I always used to go to work, or something like that. I think that's slightly different. That's a form of mindfulness. It's a form of awareness. But it's not, I don't necessarily just mean slowing down and doing the dishes really slowly, or like like eating raisins really slowly, or something like we do when we teach mindfulness courses. I do mean being a bit more aware, paying a bit more attention to your environment, but and then also, things like paying attention to how you're communicating, how you're being, how you're interacting with other people. But I'm also talking about sort of stepping back and making decisions about what it is that you want to do, and actually just reflecting on your life and sort of trying to have a bit more of a sense of living in a way of actually doing things that you want to do. Not necessarily, so that may be actually experiencing things a little bit more, but it's as much to do with actually just living in a way that you've thought about and reflected on, not just being pulled along by things, or doing things because other people seem to be doing stuff, or doing things because of a habit that you have that you didn't even mean to accumulate in the first place. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes.
I think one of the things that kind of stops me is the sort of almost like the fear of failure. Like,
right.
What if I strived and took this all really seriously, and then didn't quite make it, and then died? And I just like that almost like kind of puts me off it. So I'm like,
what would not quite making it mean?
Like, as in not gaining enlightenment.
Right. Well, the thing with that is, it's not like you have a start point and then you have enlightenment here, and it's nothing, boom, enlightenment. Actually, the path doesn't quite work like that. The more you practice, the more it will have an effect. So there are certain stages along the way which are decisive moments of perhaps certain breakthroughs or so on, which I won't go into now. But any amount of, any amount that you do the metta bhavana, any amount that you can become more compassionate, any amount that you can live more mindfully and consciously and deliberately is going to have a positive effect, regardless of whether you sort of make it or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just have, I'm such like a goals, like
right, okay.
It's like person, but
yeah,
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, well, maybe that's something for you to reflect on a little bit. Yeah. It's a terrible tragedy, isn't it, to not do something you really want to do just because you think you might not succeed at it, when actually there's not really any sense of success or failure. Do you know what I mean? I've probably got more to say than that, but we're running out of time and I can't quite articulate it. So, okay, great. So let's leave that there for this evening. Take care, everyone. If you could put your mats and cushions to the side, and we'll see you next week.